What if I told you that two of the greatest civilizations in human history, India and China, didn't just grow beside each other, but once looked each other in the eye across the Himalayas, not as rivals, but as warriors, thinkers, kings, and seekers? What if ancient generals from the Han Dynasty marched their armies close to the gates of the Mauryan Empire? What if the trade routes we now call the Silk Road were once rivers of ideas, spies, secrets, and empires ready to rise or fall at a single command? This is not mythology. This is not fiction. This is the forgotten history of when the dragon of the East brushed against the lion of the South, and the world trembled in the shadow of their encounter. Before modern borders, before the rise of nations and flags, there were realms ruled not by lines on maps, but by ambition, blood, and belief. In the vast stretches of Asia, two titans were born: the Mauryan Empire in India and the Han Dynasty in China. Separated by mountains but connected by ideas, these civilizations would go on to shape philosophy, warfare, diplomacy, and global trade. But buried beneath layers of forgotten manuscripts and dusty chronicles is a story few have dared to tell. The story of how these empires once gazed across the mountains and saw in each other a reflection of power and mystery. This is a tale of generals like Huo Qubing, who dared chase shadows across Central Asia, and of emperors like Ashoka, who turned from bloodshed to dharma. It's a story of spies moving through deserts, monks carrying scrolls instead of swords, and warriors who never met on a battlefield, yet forever altered each other's fate. This is not the story you read in textbooks. This is the untold history of Han and Mauryan, of silk and stone, of scrolls and spears, and of the forgotten moment when China met India, long before the world knew of Europe's empires or the fleets of Arabia, before the Roman legions marched west, or the Persians dreamed of conquering the seas. Two ancient powers stirred on opposite ends of Asia. In the east, the Han Dynasty rose like a phoenix from the ashes of civil war, unifying a fragmented China into a force of discipline, ambition, and technological brilliance. In the west, the Indian subcontinent echoed with the footsteps of Chandragupta Maurya, a man who defied the mighty Alexander's legacy and forged a kingdom built not only on swords but on strategy and wisdom. These were not petty kings. These were architects of civilizations, men who laid the foundations for nations that would echo across millennia. But what history forgets to mention, what dusty scrolls and broken tablets only whisper, is that these two worlds were not as separate as they seemed. Though mountains loomed between them and deserts stretched like barriers of time, the Han and the Mauryans were already aware, not of each other's borders, but of each other's existence. You see, power is like fire. It spreads, and when it burns brightly in one land, the smoke drifts into another. The Han emperors, keen observers of their neighboring realms, had heard tales of a southern land of elephants, spices, gold, and astonishing intellect. Their ambassadors and traders began to press westward, reaching the unfamiliar lands of Bactria and Sogdiana, where Indian influence was already present, a cultural echo carried by Buddhist monks and silk merchants. But trade was only the surface. Beneath the silk and spices lay espionage, diplomacy, and quiet tests of strength. In the court of the Han Emperor Wu, stories began to emerge of an ancient Indian emperor who once renounced conquest after seeing death and destruction, choosing instead a path of peace. That emperor was Ashoka, and though separated by time, his shadow still reached the minds of Han thinkers and strategists. Meanwhile, in the Indian heartland, scholars and monks discussed faraway kingdoms to the north, lands of discipline, hierarchy, and balance. The ancient Indian mind was not closed. It was curious. And the Mauryan Empire, under its final rulers, looked not just inward, but also beyond the frontiers. Not for conquest, but for comprehension. But diplomacy and trade were not the only channels of contact. On the edges of empire, where no king's flag truly flew, warriors roamed. Generals like Huo Qubing, the Han's prodigious tactician, who rode into Central Asia not only to crush the Zhongnu tribes, but to secure the unknown routes that led further west and south. In his journals, now lost but preserved in fragments by Han scribes, were references to strange scrolls, foreign monks, and the scent of a world different from his own. His mission was not only military, it was exploratory. He was the spear sent to test the edge of the map. And on the other side of that map, Indian envoys were doing the same, reaching out to Greek kingdoms, Persian remnants, and the Central Asian tribes that connected both worlds like threads in a vast cosmic web. It was during this time that one of the most fascinating developments occurred: the construction of early trade corridors, not just for goods, but for knowledge. These were the precursors of the Silk Road, long before Marco Polo would walk them. These were the roads walked by monks carrying Buddhist sutras translated into Chinese, and Han emissaries who returned with Indian herbs, languages, and philosophies. Somewhere between the mountains of the Hindu Kush and the desert sands of Taklamakan, the first true meeting happened. Not in a palace, not in a battlefield, but in a caravanserai, where a Chinese diplomat and an Indian monk sat beneath the stars and spoke in broken tongues about the nature of life, death, power, and peace. No one remembers their names. No poet sang of their meeting. But in that forgotten moment, history shifted. The Han began to look not only at their Western enemies, but at the wisdom of the South. And the Mauryans, though fading, left a legacy that seeped into the minds of Chinese scholars. From that moment, the idea of India and China as distant strangers began to blur. They were now participants in a silent conversation, one that would continue through centuries, in symbols, scripts, and silk. It was a beginning, not of war, not of alliance, but of awareness. A dawning realization that beyond the mountains lay another world, equally ancient, equally wise, equally proud. And in that realization, the seeds of a new kind of empire were sown, not built on conquest alone, but on curiosity. In the shadow of the mountains, where clouds scrape the sky and wind whispers through the stones, a quiet transformation was underway. Not of weapons or warfare, but of minds and messages carried across centuries by those who walked, not to conquer, but to connect. As the Han dynasty grew stronger under Emperor Wu's long reign, it became more than just a military machine. It became an empire of ideas. From its core in Chang'an, the pulse of the dynasty extended through roads, rivers, and ridgelines, all the way to the rugged frontier zones, where empires faded and unknown lands began. It was here, at the edge of maps, that the empire discovered its most powerful tool wasn't the sword. It was the question: what lies beyond? Who are these people, with strange customs, painted elephants, and golden scripts, written in a tongue that curves like art and sings like prayer? The same question echoed across the Indian subcontinent. Though the Mauryan Empire had declined, its memory lingered like incense in a temple, soft, potent, unforgettable. The kings that followed Ashoka, whether they ruled large territories or smaller provinces, understood that India's strength did not lie only in its armies, but in its ability to absorb, adapt, and illuminate. Monks trained in Nalanda, and Takshashila journeyed westward, carrying scrolls etched with the wisdom of the Upanishads and the compassion of the Buddha. They did not come with soldiers. They came with silence, with eyes full of calm, and hands that blessed instead of clenched. As these monks moved across Central Asia, they encountered traders from China, some on imperial missions, others in search of jade, herbs, and horses. Among these traders were literate men, trained to observe and report. They saw the monks, listened to their chants, and wrote strange descriptions back to their homeland. They spoke of temples without idols, of the concept of karma, of the cycle of birth and rebirth. And back in China, these tales reached the halls of Confucian scholars and Taoist mystics. The Chinese mind was pragmatic, rooted in balance and order. But now it was being challenged by something else. An idea of inner liberation, of life beyond the court and the clan. The teachings of the Buddha began to take root, not just as foreign import, but as a mirror that showed something deep within the Chinese soul itself. But the exchange was not one way. While Indian monks brought philosophy and peace, Chinese emissaries returned with tales of engineering marvels, of city plans aligned with stars, of bureaucracies that functioned like clockwork. Indian rulers, especially in the northwest, where Hellenistic and Central Asian influences mingled, began to adopt certain Chinese military strategies and administrative techniques. The influence of the Han could be felt in the way some Indian cities were being fortified, the way records were kept, even in the way royal messengers carried seals on silk instead of scrolls. Somewhere between the two civilizations, a hybrid vision was being born, one that did not erase identity but enriched it. One of the most remarkable figures of this era was Zhong Qian, the Han envoy, who was sent on a mission to the west, and ended up opening the very idea of the Silk Road, though his journey was filled with capture, escape, and hardship. His reports changed everything. He spoke of the Dayan, of Bactria, of lands where Indian influence was undeniable. He wrote of coins with Indian scripts, of kings who honored both Greek and Hindu gods, of places where saffron grew and Sanskrit hymns echoed in markets that sold Chinese silk. In his footsteps came other envoys, other observers. They brought back more than maps. They brought stories. And in India, Chinese presence became more than rumor. Monks returning from deserts and snowy passes told of shrines nestled in mountains where Chinese travelers lit incense and bowed. They told of Han kings curious about Dharma, of generals who sought not only victory but vision. The first documented diplomatic contact is believed to have occurred during the Kushan period, when emissaries traveled between the Han court and the rulers of the northwest Indian territories. But this contact was not a beginning. It was merely the first thread being pulled from a tapestry that had already begun to weave itself in silence. Cultural exchanges deepened. Art began to reflect new styles. In some Buddhist cave paintings of Western China, you can see Indian motifs, lotuses, Wheel of Law symbols, even depictions of Indian-looking monks guiding Chinese novices. And in India, in the remote reaches of what is now Pakistan and Kashmir, temple ruins contain carvings of dragons, creatures not native to Indian mythology, but deeply Chinese in their origin. No one announced this fusion. There were no treaties, no royal decrees. It happened slowly, like ink spreading on cloth. And yet, this quiet revolution shaped more lives than the battles of generals ever did. In the villages along the early trade routes, children grew up hearing stories that blended Indian fables with Chinese parables. Merchants learned to speak in phrases borrowed from both tongues. Even musical instruments began to share shape and sound. Perhaps the most profound exchange, however, was in the realm of time itself. The Han and the Indians did not measure time in the same way, but they both believed in cycles, in the return of things. The Chinese yin and yang and the Indian idea of samsara both reflected a world in motion, a universe that was never static. And in this philosophical overlap, something deeper emerged: a mutual respect for impermanence. In a world where most empires sought to dominate, Han and India were quietly learning to harmonize. They did not need to clash to define themselves. They simply needed to listen. And so, from the frozen passes of the Himalayas to the fragrant coasts of the Bay of Bengal, a new age was being born. Not of war, but of wonder. As the years passed and the mountains continued their silent watch, something remarkable began to unfold. A convergence not of swords or steel, but of spirit and silence. Between the great rivers of the Ganges and the Yangtze, between the salt deserts of western China and the monsoon plains of eastern India, a thread had formed, invisible yet unbreakable. It stretched through deserts and over snow, through language barriers and cultural divides, binding together two of the greatest civilizations in human memory. The Han emperors, ever curious and calculated, realized that power alone could not secure their borders. They needed ideas, balance, and a deeper understanding of the human soul. And in the ancient philosophies of India, they found an echo of something familiar yet foreign. From the smoky halls of Confucian scholars to the silent sanctums of Taoist sages, whispers of Indian thought began to stir. Karma, Dharma, Moksha. These were not just foreign words, they were clues to a different way of ruling, of living, of understanding one's place in the vastness of time. At the same time, Indian thinkers and rulers had begun to look outward. The legacy of the once ruthless conqueror turned monk emperor, had left a deep imprint on the subcontinent. His rock edicts, carved across hills and caves, spoke of tolerance, compassion, and inquiry. But they also hinted at curiosity, of lands beyond, of kings in far-off places, who might share his vision of righteous rule. And so began a subtle race, not of arms, but of influence. The Han began sending more emissaries westward, pushing into the territories of the Yuezhi, the Sokas, and eventually the budding Kushan Empire, whose kings themselves were part Indian, part Central Asian, part nomadic. These lands became the bridge, not just geographical, but cultural. Here, Chinese coins bore Indian scripts. Here, Buddhist monasteries taught both Pali and Chinese. Here, ideas fused, in the fire of necessity and trade. And through it all, the unseen hands of Han generals and Indian sages kept moving the pieces of a game no one fully understood. Huo Qubing, the young Han general who had stormed across Central Asia like a force of nature, may never have stepped foot in India. But his victories cleared the path for contact. He pushed back the Zhongnu tribes that had blocked the western roads, opening channels that would eventually flow with monks, merchants, and dreams. In turn, Indian rulers, through their alliances with the Kushans and Bactrians, began to see China not as myth, but as a mirror, a place where emperors ruled with ritual, where governance was an art, and where the cosmos itself was reflected in earthly order. What began as curiosity slowly became admiration. Chinese historians of the Han era began documenting what little they knew about India, calling it Tianzhu, the heavenly land. They wrote of tall, dark-skinned people who lived by sacred rivers, of a caste of wise men who renounced everything, of kings who built hospitals instead of prisons. To them, India was a land of paradox. powerful yet peaceful, rich yet detached. And in India, Chinese visitors were slowly being recognized, not just as traders, but as seekers. Some came with scrolls, others with swords, but most came with questions. They asked about the origins of life, the nature of the soul, the cycle of rebirth, and Indian sages, with calm smiles and open hearts, shared what they knew, not to convert, but to connect. In the high passes of the Himalayas, where oxygen thins and silence deepens, small hermitages began to appear, places where Chinese pilgrims rested, where Indian monks chanted into the wind, and where the first handwritten Chinese sutras were born. These places were not marked on any map. They belonged to no king, and yet they were the true embassies of this ancient relationship. The influence began to seep into art. Han pottery began to reflect Indian floral patterns. Indian sculptures adopted more defined eyes and garments with Chinese folds. Musical rhythms, culinary ingredients, even martial techniques began to borrow from each other. And deeper than all this, a quiet trust was forming. Not alliance, not submission, but mutual respect. It was during this phase that a legendary figure emerged. A monk by the name of Lokaksema, originally from the Gandhara region, a place that straddled India and Central Asia. He journeyed to China during the late 2nd century CE, carrying with him precious Buddhist texts. But he did more than translate them. He ignited a movement. Under his influence, Buddhist temples sprang up in China like stars piercing the night. Chinese monks, inspired by his teachings, began making pilgrimages to India, a reverse migration that would define the centuries to come. Though the Mauryan Empire was now long gone, its spirit of diplomacy, intellectual exchange, and ethical governance lived on, and the Han Dynasty, in embracing these ideas, was beginning to change from within. Its rulers began to see beyond borders. Its people began to look beyond race. And its scholars began to write of India not as the other, but as the elder, a civilization that had walked the path before them. There were still no treaties, no grand meetings of emperors, no combined armies, but there was something more powerful. A shared understanding that greatness did not require conquest, it required connection. And so, with each passing year, the invisible bridge between Han China and ancient India grew stronger, built not of stone, but of spirit. It was in the deep silence of high mountain passes and in the soft murmur of desert winds that the truth began to take shape. A truth older than politics, deeper than conquest, and more enduring than kings. China and India, those ancient realms of endless sky and sacred soil, had begun to recognize each other not as competitors on a chessboard of empires, but as reflections in a mirror, held up by time itself. Across the Himalayas, through narrow trails carved by wind and faith, Indian monks continued their sacred mission, not to convert, but to connect. They carried no banners, no weapons, only wisdom wrapped in worn scrolls and the soft cadence of Sanskrit sutras that sang of impermanence and inner peace. These monks did not ride war horses, but walked barefoot, and yet they reached farther than armies. Through the oasis cities of Central Asia, Kashgar, Khotan, Dunhuang, they left behind more than teachings. They left seeds, and the Chinese, known for their precise order and disciplined thought, received these seeds with both curiosity and awe. In the courts of the Han Dynasty, where once only the teachings of Confucius and Laozi held sway, new voices entered the dialogue. The philosophy of suffering, the Eightfold Path, the Bodhisattva's vow. These ideas slowly took root in a land that valued harmony and sought cosmic balance. And in this merging of thoughts, something rare happened. The Chinese did not erase the Indian ideas. They did not rewrite them to suit their own image. Instead, they translated, they interpreted, and they added their own flavor without extinguishing the original flame. What emerged was not an imitation, but a unique evolution. Chinese Buddhism, born from Indian roots, shaped by Chinese soil. This transformation did not go unnoticed. As temples began to rise in northern China, their shapes echoed Indian stupas, but with curved roofs and carved beams that bore the elegance of the Han aesthetic. The iconography of Buddha began to appear in Chinese form, his robes more flowing, his features more familiar, yet his essence unchanged. And even as artists and sculptors shaped divine forms, scholars worked tirelessly to preserve the words. In the caves of Dunhuang, entire walls were covered in sacred text, translations of Indian sutras written by hand, each stroke a prayer, each line a bridge between two worlds. But while the Chinese were absorbing the spiritual gifts of India, the Indians too were learning. The Indian subcontinent had always been a sponge for external ideas, whether from Persia, Greece, or Central Asia. But the Chinese brought something different, a sense of order, structure, and discipline in preservation. Where Indian spirituality was fluid, Chinese methods gave it form. Monasteries began to adopt cataloging systems. Records were kept of teachings and teachers, and pilgrimages became organized journeys rather than solitary wanderings. The Silk Road was no longer just a route for trade. It had become a spiritual highway. Caravans carried not only silk and spices but statues of the Buddha, scrolls of philosophy, prayer beads, and incense. And at every rest stop, under every lantern-lit sky, the languages of Sanskrit and Chinese mingled like two ancient rivers meeting at last. But this meeting was not without complexity. There were moments of mistrust, of misinterpretation. Some Chinese officials feared that Buddhism, with its emphasis on detachment and monastic life, could weaken loyalty to the emperor. In India too, some orthodox schools viewed Chinese interpretations as distant echoes of the original truth. Yet these challenges did not break the bond. They tested it, refined it, and in doing so, made it stronger. In time, figures emerged who would serve as living symbols of this union. Monks who had studied both in Nalanda and Chang'an, philosophers who quoted Confucius, alongside the Buddha, artists who carved Indian deities in Chinese jade. These were not exceptions. They were the beginning of a new chapter, and in this chapter, a quiet revolution unfolded. The ordinary people, merchants, craftsmen, porters, and scribes, began to carry the story forward. In their daily interactions, their blended rituals, their children's lullabies, that spoke of dragons and Dharma side by side, the soul of the Han Mauryan connection endured. For while kings may draw borders, people erase them with the simple act of sharing. And so it continued. A civilization-to-civilization dialogue, too vast for any one scroll, too deep for any one temple. A bridge, not of stone, but of silence, understanding, and timeless respect. It had begun centuries earlier, when a Han general glimpsed Indian artifacts in Bactria, or when an Indian monk bowed before the altars of Chang'an. But now it was no longer a beginning. It was a bond, invisible, immortal. In the stillness of ancient temples and the dust of forgotten trade roads, the pulse of two civilizations began to beat in unison. Not loudly, not with thunder, but like the rhythm of breath. Quiet, steady, essential. India and China, separated by towering mountains and vast cultural differences, were now speaking to one another through gestures, ideas, and sacred texts that crossed deserts, not with the speed of conquest, but with the patience of seekers. As the Han Dynasty matured into a golden age of stability and philosophical reflection, its gaze turned further inward and outward simultaneously, seeking meaning not only in its own heritage of Confucian and Taoist thought, but in the philosophies and spiritual practices carried in by monks who looked different, spoke in riddles, and held in their hands scrolls written in languages no one in the capital could yet read. It was in this moment of cultural hunger that Indian thought found its most fertile ground. Buddhism, once born in the foothills of the Himalayas, had returned to the same mountains, now carried by wind-burnt monks in tattered robes and eternal silence, and the Chinese listened. They did more than listen. They wrote, they translated, they debated, and they evolved. The imperial court, once the bastion of rigid rituals and ancestral order, became a new arena where questions of suffering, desire, impermanence, and karma were no longer foreign, but familiar. Chinese emperors commissioned translations of Buddhist texts, their scholars learning Sanskrit and Prakrit, as if decoding the language of the cosmos itself. Among the most transformative examples was the Emperor Ming of Han, whose dream of a golden figure inspired him to send envoys to the West in search of this mysterious sage. What they brought back was not just a statue or scripture, it was a pathway that would change the empire's soul. And while Buddhism spread through China like morning light through a quiet forest, Indian influence was not a one-way tide. The Chinese themselves, with their engineering, organization, and disciplined worldview, began to shape the way Indian monks approached preservation, temple structure, and the documentation of spiritual practices. Indian thought was fluid and vast, but the Chinese mind brought clarity, precision, and structural strength. The two together became a force of spiritual architecture that no border could contain. In cities like Luoyang and Chang'an, Buddhist monasteries thrived, echoing with chants that began in Bihar and now echoed across the Yellow River. Indian monks like Dharmaroksha and Kumarayeva became household names, revered not just as foreigners, but as bridges between heaven and earth. But while cities blossomed with thought, the roads between these realms still bore the risks of nature and man. Bandits, sandstorms, political upheavals, all stood in the way of this fragile connection. And yet, the desire to reach each other never ceased. On the other side, in the Indian subcontinent, Chinese pilgrims became figures of awe and respect. They were not ordinary travelers. They were scholars, often sponsored by emperors, who braved impossible terrains to sit under the same Bodhi tree where the Buddha had once reached enlightenment. The names of Faxian, Xuanzang, and Yajing would become immortal in Indian memory, not for their bravery alone, but for their humility. These men came not to judge, not to preach, but to learn, and in doing so, they reminded the Indian sages of the power of their own heritage. The Chinese did not just take away knowledge, they mirrored it back. And through this reflection, India too reawakened. Forgotten texts were dusted off, ancient temples repaired, lost rituals revived. Because sometimes, you only realize the beauty of your own mirror when someone else sees their reflection in it. And yet, even as this spiritual fusion deepened, political currents churned beneath. The Han Dynasty, powerful though it was, would not last forever. Dynasties fall, as do empires, and when they do, they leave behind not just ruins, but legacies, seeds that lie dormant until the world is ready again. In India too, the Mauryan echo was fading, replaced by regional powers, new dynasties, and fresh political dreams. But something had already changed. No matter who ruled from Pataliputra or from Chang'an, the bridge had been built. It was no longer about which king sat on which throne. It was about the thought that flowed beyond the throne. The bond between Han China and ancient India had matured into something no war could sever, because it had been written not on stone or scrolls, but on the soul. A new generation rose, born in monasteries shaped by both Indian architecture and Chinese design, educated in doctrines that fused Dharma with discipline, and guided by teachers who could quote both Confucius and the Dhammapada without hesitation. This was a generation that no longer asked, "Where are you from?" but instead, "What do you seek?" And the answer, more often than not, was the same: truth, compassion, wisdom, peace. As dawn broke across the Himalayas and golden rays touched both lands, it became clear that the story was no longer about when China met India. The story had become how China and India learned to walk the same path, without ever erasing the uniqueness of their footprints. As the earth turned beneath stars that had watched empires rise and fall, and as the winds swept across lands where silk once flowed and elephants once marched, the connection between ancient China and India deepened beyond imagination. It was no longer just a passage of monks or scrolls, or the whispers of wandering pilgrims. It had become a channel through which identity itself was reshaped. In the great Han capital of Luoyang, the echo of Indian voices now lingered in temple courtyards, and in the incense-filled halls of Buddhist monasteries, Chinese and Indian chants rose together like prayers stitched from two souls. There was no declaration, no treaty signed, no king who claimed victory in this silent meeting of minds. And yet, it was the most powerful conquest of all, not of land, but of thought. While the Chinese built great walls to hold back invaders, they opened their hearts to the philosophy that traveled without swords. Indian Dharma walked unarmed, yet its impact pierced deeper than any blade. Emperors who once judged strength by legions and tax rolls now sat in council with monks who spoke of detachment, compassion, and the illusion of power. And in India, where ancient traditions had long guided the rhythm of life, a new reflection emerged. Chinese discipline, their reverence for order, and their remarkable ability to preserve and protect knowledge inspired Indian scholars and temple builders alike. From Nalanda to Kashmir, libraries grew larger. Scriptures were copied with greater care, and records of spiritual lineages began to be catalogued. With the kind of precision that had defined Han bureaucracy, the message was simple but profound. Knowledge deserved not only to be passed on, but to be protected. In the remote regions of Central Asia, where the line between Indian and Chinese influence blurred into the windswept sands of the Silk Road, the fusion of these civilizations took physical form. Caves carved into cliffs became temples of dual identity. In places like Dunhuang, artists sculpted Buddhas with Indian gestures but Chinese features, and the murals spoke in a visual language that belonged to both, and to neither. Here, monks wore robes dyed in Indian saffron, but stitched in Chinese patterns. They recited Sanskrit verses in tones molded by Chinese intonation. This was not the confusion of cultures. It was their culmination. Even trade evolved into something deeper. Caravans no longer just carried silk and spices. They carried medicinal texts, astronomical charts, musical instruments, and mathematical theories. The concept of zero, born in the Indian intellect, traveled eastward. The Chinese abacus, perfected over generations, moved westward. Between the numbers, the logic, and the harmony, a shared pursuit emerged, not of conquest or wealth, but of understanding. And while this understanding flourished among monks and scholars, it also reached the hearts of the common people. In small villages where Indian merchants set up shrines and Chinese travelers rested their horses, Stories were told to children that mixed elements of both worlds. A dragon who learns compassion from a bodhisattva, a prince who finds wisdom not in war, but in stillness. These tales, passed from mouth to mouth, generation to generation, sowed the seeds of a new kind of memory, one that did not belong to any one nation, but to the collective spirit of Asia. And yet, despite all this harmony, the world beyond remained turbulent. Empires crumbled, dynasties changed, new threats rose in the form of internal strife and external invasions. But the bond between Han and India endured, because it was not anchored in politics, it was anchored in people, in monks who risked death to walk across frozen mountains for a glimpse of a sacred site, in Chinese pilgrims who stayed for decades in Indian monasteries, copying texts by hand, feeding lepers, and learning languages foreign to their tongue but familiar to their heart. Among these, the legendary figure of Faxian emerged, not merely as a traveler, but as a vessel of civilizational continuity. His journey across India, through forests and famine, through kingdoms and ashrams, was not for fame or for gold. It was for faith, and when he returned to China, he brought with him more than scriptures. He brought memories. He wrote of Indian customs, of Buddhist rites, of public hospitals, and peaceful cities. He wrote of kings who ruled with justice, and people who worshipped without fear. His accounts painted a portrait of India that inspired generations of Chinese thinkers, giving birth to a reverence that no military alliance could have achieved. And in India, his presence, like that of others before and after him, sparked pride. Pride not in conquest, but in contribution. For once, India saw itself, not through the eyes of invaders or colonizers, but through the gaze of an eager learner who came in search of truth and left with his soul transformed. The message echoed through time. The greatest influence is not forced, it is chosen. And so, this invisible thread between the Han and the heart of India was pulled tighter. Through wars, droughts, famines, and reformations, it remained unbroken, because it had been woven not by rulers or generals, but by dreamers, seekers, scribes, and sages who saw beyond the limits of geography into the limitless landscape of human potential. The bridge between China and India was now spiritual, intellectual, emotional, and eternal. As centuries passed, that sacred bridge, once invisible and soft as silk, began to shape the future in unexpected ways. The Buddhist path, carved by early pilgrims, soon became a highway of shared wisdom, guiding emperors and artisans alike. Chinese medicine began to carry traces of Indian herbal theory, while Indian astrology adopted elements of Chinese lunar observation. Even in matters of statecraft, echoes of one another could be heard. The Arthashastra's pragmatic wisdom found resonance in the Confucian ideal of harmonious governance. And though these connections were never codified by treaties or etched in stone upon royal monuments, they lived on, in scrolls, in sculptures, in the reverent silence of those who copied sutras by candlelight. In the villages of Bengal and Yunnan, where the scent of jasmine drifted past thatched roofs, a potter might unknowingly paint a motif borrowed from a Dunhuang mural, while in Sichuan, a weaver's loom might spin a pattern first imagined in Gujarat. These were not acts of conquest, but whispers of connection, the kind that leave no scars, only stories. And stories, once born, rarely die. They linger in lullabies, sung to restless children, in the way a monk bows to a stranger, or in the faded ink of a forgotten traveler's diary. They were the soul of a friendship that outlived kings. And so it continued, silently, beneath the grand events recorded in royal chronicles. while generals laid siege to cities and dynasties fell under the weight of their own ambition. The seekers, the ones who asked not what they could take, but what they could understand, kept walking, kept writing, kept listening. In the twilight of the Gupta era, when India's golden age began to dim, Chinese pilgrims like Xuanzang ventured deeper than before, traveling not as foreigners but as kin. And India welcomed them, not with armies, but with open doors and the fragrance of sandalwood. For what they sought, truth, not tribute, was always freely given. Xuanzang's path led him to Nalanda, the crown jewel of India's intellectual legacy, where thousands of monks debated ideas with fierce devotion and gentle hearts. He studied there not as a guest, but as a student among equals. When he returned home, his accounts lit a fire in China's spiritual imagination. Monasteries swelled, libraries expanded, and Buddhism, already deeply rooted, flourished with new vigor. But what he brought back was more than doctrine. It was the lived essence of a civilization that had treated him not as an outsider, but as a brother in the search for meaning. His writings revealed not just facts, but feelings. The kindness of Indian villagers, the humility of its teachers, the rhythm of its sacred rituals. In return, Chinese scribes recorded his journey with the care of a nation honoring a holy man. And back in India, long after Xuanzang's footsteps faded from the earth, his presence remained, in the legends told near temple fires, and in the pride of monks who remembered his name. This was not history written by blood and betrayal, but by respect and remembrance. Through the haze of time, as political borders shifted and languages evolved, that thread between Han and Hind remained steady. Now less a rope and more a root, unseen but vital, nourishing ideas from both ends. It was felt in the ink of every Chinese text that spoke of Dharma, and in every Indian scroll that referenced celestial dragons or jade mountains. And when darkness fell, when both lands suffered, under invaders, colonizers, and the erasure of centuries, it was this invisible root that held firm beneath the surface. For no empire, however brutal, could erase a bond not built on conquest, but on curiosity, a bond that whispered, "I see you, I hear you, I learn from you." And perhaps that is why, despite all the violence of the centuries, China and India remained drawn to one another like two stars, caught in the same gravitational pull, not identical, not even always in agreement, but aligned in a quiet understanding that knowledge, when shared with love, becomes immortal. And yet, as the centuries turned, new waves of transformation swept across both nations. In China, the Tang dynasty rose like a phoenix, shimmering with artistic brilliance and cosmopolitan confidence. Chang'an became a city where Persian merchants, Indian yogis, Turkish warriors, and Arab scholars could all be found walking the same roads, their languages blending into a song of civilizations. The Buddhist teachings that had once arrived on fragile scrolls now echoed from towering pagodas and monasteries, filled with golden statues and silk-robed monks. But these symbols were not purely Chinese, nor purely Indian. They were a synthesis, born from the spiritual marriage of two great cultures. Even the artwork changed. A Chinese painter might paint the face of a bodhisattva with Indian grace, while Indian sculptors began carving with the delicate touch of Chinese realism. And far beyond the cities, in mountain passes and desert outposts, wandering monks still journeyed from Bihar to Beijing, from Ujjain to Xi'an, carrying more than words. They carried trust. In the Indian subcontinent, kingdoms shifted like sands, but the hunger for wisdom remained. South Indian rulers, hearing of Chinese learning and trade, sent envoys with gifts of sandalwood, precious stones, and manuscripts. In return, Chinese emperors dispatched their own messengers, not with swords, but with silks and poems. Their messages spoke not of conquest, but of kinship. In Buddhist temples near the Bay of Bengal, Chinese inscriptions began appearing beside Sanskrit ones. Names like Yujing, Xuanzang, and Faxian were now remembered not just as travelers, but as torchbearers, and still, in village shrines and forest caves, stories continued to flow. A Chinese warrior guided by Indian wisdom, a Mauryan princess who dreamed of dragons. These tales, though never written in royal records, lived longer than the reigns of kings. They became the folk memory of Asia, a continent that had once been divided by mountains and rivers, but was now slowly being stitched together by the hands of pilgrims and poets. Trade routes evolved into idea routes. Ships crossing the Indian Ocean carried statues of the Buddha and boxes of ink, sandalwood and scrolls, spices and sutras. In some ports of Southeast Asia, the lines between Indian, Chinese, and local culture vanished entirely, replaced by temples with multi-tiered roofs and Sanskrit prayers, etched in Chinese calligraphy. No war had ever achieved what peace had quietly created. But, as all stories go, even the brightest lights must pass through shadows. The thread between Han and Bharat, once so radiant, now found itself tested by tides far beyond the wisdom of monks and the kindness of pilgrims. The fall of dynasties, the rise of new faiths, and the ambition of empires began to reshape the very world this bond had helped illuminate. In India, the golden glow of Buddhist centers, like Nalanda and Vikramashila, flickered under the growing flame of other forces. Monasteries that once echoed with the sound of Chinese footsteps now stood silent. Some burned, some abandoned, some forgotten beneath the vines of history. The great river of knowledge that had once flowed eastward began to dry. In China, too, change swept across the landscape, as the Song dynasty gave way to the Mongols, and the Mongols to the Ming. A new order emerged, one more cautious of the outside world, more guarded, more consumed with survival than spiritual exchange. The Silk Road, once alive with laughter, prayer, and philosophy, became more a road of war and wary glances. Pirates stalked the sea routes. Raiders haunted the mountain paths, and yet the ember of connection never died. Even in retreat, the memory remained. The names of Indian scholars still lingered in Chinese texts. The old scrolls, carefully guarded in temple vaults, spoke of foreign lands where truth had once bloomed. And in India, though Buddhism waned, the stories of Chinese pilgrims were still told, not as myths, but as chapters of pride. There was something profound in knowing that another civilization had once traveled thousands of miles, not to conquer or colonize, but to listen, to learn, to sit barefoot in the dust and say, "Teach me." That memory became sacred. And even in the darkest eras, when colonial shadows covered the subcontinent and China bent under the pressure of opium and gunpowder diplomacy, the ancient bond whispered from beneath the ruins. It reminded those who would listen that true power does not lie in armies or coins, but in respect, in curiosity, in the quiet humility of one soul reaching out to another. And when both nations began to rise again, centuries later, they did not start as strangers. Somewhere, buried in the roots of their awakening, was the old rhythm, the call and response of Han and Hind, China and India, dragon and elephant, thought and spirit. A rhythm not forgotten, merely waiting. And so, after centuries of silence, songs, scriptures, and storms, the story of ancient China and India stands not as a tale of nations at war, but of civilizations that listened. While so much of the world's history is written in blood and betrayal, here was a different kind of legacy, one forged in the quiet dignity of shared truth. Theirs was a relationship born not from treaties signed under threat, but from scrolls carried across deserts, from steps taken in devotion, from questions asked in humility and answered in kindness. The deserts of Xinjiang still remember the whispers of Indian monks, while the forests of Bihar still hum with the footsteps of Chinese pilgrims. Even in the absence of monuments, even where dust has buried the names of the kings and scholars, their spirit lingers. In every temple bell, in every preserved manuscript, in every child's story about a compassionate dragon or a meditating sage. This was never merely an exchange of religion or art. It was a meeting of philosophies, of identities, of worldviews. When India gave China the Dharma, China returned it, not just with reverence, but with preservation. What may have faded on the subcontinent found protection in Chinese scrolls. And when China sent back its painted sutras, its structured logic, and its deep respect for harmony, India responded not with rejection, but with wonder. The result was a mirror, not of sameness, but of resonance. Two great cultures saw themselves reflected, not as competitors, but as kindred spirits walking different paths toward the same light. And though centuries passed, that light never truly dimmed. In today's age, an age of speed and steel, of digital noise and forgotten roots, the story still breathes. Scholars once again translate the texts Faxian and Yuanzhang carried. Temples are restored. Archives are opened. And young minds, thousands of years removed from the first steps of those ancient monks, now look across borders not with suspicion, but with a hunger to understand what once was, because deep within the soul of both nations lies the same question. What is the purpose of civilization, if not to elevate the spirit? And who better to answer that question than two of the oldest civilizations to ever walk the earth, shoulder to shoulder, book to book, prayer to prayer? This is not the end of their journey. It never was. For stories like these, born from the soil and shaped by soul, do not end. They echo in classrooms, in temples, in libraries, in lantern-lit alleys, and in the dreams of those who still believe that wisdom can travel farther than warships, and compassion can outlast empires. This is not just history. This is legacy. A legacy written not in the names of rulers, but in the footsteps of seekers. And this is what we honor here, on Legacy of Nation, where stories are not just remembered, they are reborn.